ship left on the dock for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards.
A little while ago, a breakfast food company by the name of Magic Spoon approached me to advertise on the channel. And while the name beautifully harkens back to a classic science fiction movie on your planet, yes, I said classic, check what year it came out, I had to tell them that we here at Sacred Cow Shipyards don't really eat cereal, or honestly, much of anything. They told me that was okay, so in the interests of due diligence, we procured a sample population, and once we got past the whole, "Where am I?" and "How did I get here?" they agreed that this high-protein cereal reminded them of their childhood favorites, only now with grown-up ingredients and zero sugar. Plus, it's perfectly suited for a low-carb or soy-free lifestyle. Anyways, the aforementioned sample population was given, well, samples, specifically from the fruity, frosted, cocoa, and peanut butter variety pack, and seemed quite happy with them, especially noting it maintained its crunch in milk. And then they were mind-wiped and sent on their merry way, so you don't have to worry about them. Regardless, click the link below to grab a variety pack of your own and try it today. And be sure to use the promo code DOCMASTER at checkout to get $5 off any order, or go to magicspoon.com/DocMaster. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. If you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked, which is massively better than what we at the Shipyards offer with regards to our cubes. So, click the link below or scan the QR code on the screen and use the code DOCMASTER for $5 off, or go to magicspoon.com/you-guessed-it-DOCMASTER to save $5 today. And they will literally ship it to your door on a common carrier, which is just as well, because I'm honestly not sure the ship we're talking about today could even handle a simple cereal delivery. But before we get to that point, I would like to ask you a simple question. Well, a deceptively simple question. If you've been watching this channel long enough, you know that most of my questions are a lot more complicated than they look, and that's because I want you to think, as hard as it might be sometimes. But regardless, the question: what is a freighter? Your nightmarish Wikipedia system defines a freighter or cargo ship as a merchant ship that carries cargo, goods, and materials from one port to another. And on the surface, that is not a wrong definition, especially when you look at the concept of freighters over the course of human history. But I would add two significant caveats to that definition. They need to carry the cargo from point A to point B as quickly as possible, and they need to unload the cargo at point B and take on new cargo as quickly as possible. Now, yes, a freighter can be a freighter without doing either of those things, but to be a good freighter, to be a functional freighter, to be a freighter that anyone wants to keep around, you have to be able to do both. The point A to point B aspect is fairly straightforward. Anytime cargo is in transit, it's not making anyone money. In fact, it's costing people money by way of the opportunity cost tied up in the product. That is to say, there is actual money, currency value, tied up in those things that are slowly floating their way across your oceans. And until those things are sold to the next person, the company who put those things on that freighter can't do anything with the money that is wrapped up with them. So getting them from A to B as fast as possible makes a lot of sense. Incidentally, this whole opportunity cost concept is also why inventory is technically a problem for companies. They want to keep inventory as low as possible while still being able to meet immediate demand, which of course brings us to the just-in-time inventory system that has taken over your world, and how ultimately fragile that entire construct is, but that's probably a separate episode on possibly a different channel. Now, the second part of my initial caveat, the unload and reload as fast as possible, makes a certain degree of sense in that context too. The product is still not making any money while it's being unloaded or while it's being loaded onto the ship, but that's not the entire problem. The big problem is that most of your terrestrial transshipment ports charge by the hour. And they ain't cheap. And yes, you heard that right. It's by the hour. So the faster you can unload and then reload again, the less you have to spend on the port itself. And this again makes a certain degree of sense from the whole opportunity cost problem. The ports make money by unloading and loading ships. And if a ship is just hanging out there doing nothing, they're not unloading it or loading it. So they're going to charge at the same rate anyways, so you might as well leave. This is why you see so many freighters at anchor off of major ports. They're either waiting to go in to unload, or they're waiting to go in to load, or they're just waiting until further tasking, and they don't want to be tied up because then they get billed for that. Anchorages are, by and large, in most locations free, and all you have to do is radio into harbor and request a taxi boat to come out and pick up your crew if they want some shore time, and that's massively cheaper than actually tying up against a pier. So yeah, the next time you eat a little plastic pack of pears in juice that were grown in Argentina, packed in Thailand, and sold in once Great Britain, just understand exactly how much money was involved in moving those little pears around, and how, despite all that, it was still cheaper to do that. Because cargo hauling is fundamentally driven by cost. Cheaper things win. And like I said, a freighter can still be horrible in terms of speed and horrible in terms of ladening it and unladening it, but it realistically wouldn't be around for very long, because no one will be willing to put up with it. Which now, yes, finally does bring us to the topic of this week's episode. The YT-1300 class from Star Wars in general, and the Millennium Falcon in specific, are shitty freighters. I'm going to say it right up front. They are shit. In fact, in general, the YT-1300 is pretty ship to begin with. So I guess it couldn't be any better of a freighter than it could just be a generic ship. Now I guess I should back up, and I suppose I could consider apologizing. I mean no disrespect to Joe Johnston. And if you don't know that name, he is in fact the designer behind the Millennium Falcon, as well as a prolific director, actor, and special effects producer dude. He's worked on everything from Star Wars to Captain America the First Avenger and a whole pile of stuff in between. He's a pretty big OG when you get right down to it. And again, I do not mean to cast aspersions on his work. The reality is the Millennium Falcon, and thereby the rest of the YT-1300 class, since that entire thing was a retcon built off of the Millennium Falcon itself, was kind of a rush job. But before we get there, I suppose I should dispense of one particular piece of urban mythology that seems to keep lingering around. The Millennium Falcon was not, in fact, inspired by a partially eaten hamburger and an olive sitting next to it. This is straight from Joe Johnston himself. It is basically apocryphal. It's a fun story. It does kind of explain the general purpose shape of the ship, but apparently it never really happened. Instead, what did happen was, well, a mess. The entire production of the original Star Wars, that is to say Episode 4, A New Hope, which wasn't really called that at the time, is kind of a crazy story. And honestly, this episode is way too short to dig into all those particular details. Lots of stuff was going on, it almost didn't happen, blah, 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 so on and so forth. In terms of the Millennium Falcon itself, well, it was originally simply referred to as the pirate ship. Yes, Han Solo was originally meant to be a pirate, not just an average scallywag, smuggler, whatever, but a full-bore pirate. And the original version of his ship, the pirate ship, which eventually got named the Millennium Falcon, looked kind of like this in various iterations. You may notice that it looks a shocking amount like a blockade runner. Well, there's a reason for that. The ship, the pirate ship, was mocked up and arted up and painted and drawn and sketched, and they even made like not full size, but like 4 or 5 foot long models of it to show what it was going to look like in the movie. And then someone kind of pointed out that they looked a whole lot like the Eagle shuttles from the Space 1999 series. And yes, I have heard your requests. We will eventually get around to those. Either way, as soon as someone pointed out the similarity between the pirate ship and the Eagle shuttle, George Lucas decided that he wasn't going to look like he was riding on some TV show's coattails and requested a total redesign of this ship. But he kept the core idea around, made it bigger, made it chunkier, and made it into the blockade runner we now know and love. And yes, in fact, we will do an episode about them in the future as well. Anyways, once that bug got planted in George Lucas's brain, he had to dispense of the original pirate ship and asked Joe Johnston to make something that was not that, specifically something kind of flying saucer-esque. Not necessarily a flying saucer proper, but something in that genre. And it was requested of Joe to keep around two elements from the original pirate ship. The cockpit, which is probably inspired by something like the B-29 Stratofortress or something like that, and the radar dish, which is kind of funny because it's like one of the only radar, radio, sensor, whatever dishes you actually see in the Star Wars universe. But again, this was just when everything was being slammed together, so I can't blame them for not getting their story straight at the beginning, I suppose, because this was a, like I said, rush job. I believe Joe had approximately 4 weeks to whip up a whole new design before they had to build it and film it and do stuff with it. And some of the sketches that Joe slammed out, which is functionally amazing to me that you humies can just pound this stuff out using every ounce of imagination you have and still making something real with it. Well, it turns out you see those later in Star Wars. For example, that one looks a whole lot like the Ghost, doesn't it? And then a few of these other designs that he made on the way to getting to the Millennium Falcon, well, I guess we'll get there in a bit, won't we? Regardless, as I said, Joe Johnston is a beast of a humie, and I again still constantly mean no disrespect to him. This was a rush job, and it wasn't entirely clear that this whole Star Wars thing would ever take off. And then it did, and then things got weird, and now here I am bitching about details. As I do. And really, a lot of my complaints are due to the retcon nature of filling in the blanks that were left in the 4 weeks of just pounding out the design and making it happen. For example, Joe Johnston specifically stated that he wanted a long horizontal slot-shaped engine at the back instead of the traditional round nacelles seen on almost every other ship. In other words, he wanted the engines to be pointing aft, kind of like that sketch of the ghost-like ship, but then, over the years, well, I guess we can start there. According to the Haynes YT-1300 Millennium Falcon Owner's Workshop Manual, and yes, this is a no-joke, real, honest-to-God book on your planet being sold today, those sublight engines that occupy that slot at the back of the Millennium Falcon are actually radial. And yes, we all know that Star Wars plays fast and loose with propulsion methods, so maybe they're just radially pointing, but they somehow duck themselves directly aft or whatever. Oh no, they're fusion torches. Those are moderately hard to duct, and there is no real ducting aside from the magnetic and physical containment wrapped around the fusion torches that are radially configured. And given that they are radially configured, and given that there does not appear to be any kind of directing the force afterwards where it should be, and given that the outermost engines are probably about 30 degrees off axis, give or take a little, for every unit of thrust those furthest out engines create, you only get 0.866 units aft and half a unit out. You're wasting so much energy. And still, like I said, Star Wars is playing fast and loose with drives, but by and large, the direction the drives point is opposite the direction they go. And in this case, the Millennium Falcon has drives sticking out its sides, basically. It doesn't need that. Now, if they had some little weird comment about how you can use those offset engines to increase the maneuverability of the ship by, say, turning off the offset engine on the port side, which makes it easier to turn to the starboard, then that'd be fine. But as it is, we have engines that are operating at, 85% efficiency max, and also doing weird things to your flight dynamics. Why? I mean, I get getting away from the nacelle engine concepts, like the X-Wings and the Y-Wings, and basically every other ship and every other verse, blah, 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 nacelles, engines, so on and so forth. I like the idea of integrating the engine. I just wish they had actually followed Joe Johnston's original plan of having the integrated engine point all aft, as opposed to be radial. Why is it radial? You could have some benefits from that, but they never mention them, so why are we bothering? Which I guess is one of my core complaints about these kind of retcons. I mean, yes, Joe Johnston wanted the band of engines on the back as opposed to the nacelles, fine. And logically, looking at the Millennium Falcon and the fact that it is a flying saucer-inspired shape, the engines might be mounted radially. Also, that makes sense as long as you explain why. Anyone with any kind of fundamental understanding of trigonometry or physics will start asking why your offset engines are, well, offset and not pointing aft. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing at that point. So yes, make up whatever story you want about why things are set up the way they are, but at least make them make sense, even in-universe. There's not even an in-universe explanation as to why these things are so far off axis. Okay, fine. I've been talking about the engines enough, and I suppose I should move on to something else, shouldn't I? Because, engines move things. Anyways, let's talk about the weapons of the Millennium Falcon and actually the YT-1300 class in general. The kind of non-canonical explanation for why all of Star Wars' weapons are kind of line of sight only is because the electronic warfare suite in Star Wars, the electronic warfare technology in that universe, has advanced to the point that if you can see it, you can shoot it, and if you can't, good fucking luck. Now again, this is a retcon. This is an explanation of why Lucas decided to produce World War II aerial combat scenarios in space, where you can only shoot things you can see. And given that these are spaceships, and given that electronic warfare is a thing, the only reason that you would have to reduce yourself to only being able to shoot things you can see is because electronic warfare has advanced to the point where you can't trust your own computers. Honestly, as retcons go, that is not a bad answer. And then the Millennium Falcon comes along. You see, the original Corellian Engineering Corporation YT-1300 craft actually only came with a single laser cannon on the dorsal side of the ship. And it was basically slave to the bow-stern axis of the ship. Whichever way you pointed the ship, you pointed the gun that way. And Lando Calrissian figured that was good enough and left it be. And then apparently Han Solo had other plans. Because Han Solo took that single laser cannon and replaced it with a Corellian Engineering Corporation AG Tech 2G quad laser cannon, and then mirrored it on the ventral side of the ship as well, and then turret mounted them. See, like I said, the original laser cannon on the YT-1300 was just slave forward. It didn't have any rotational aspect to it, and that's fine. You point the ship and you pull the trigger and bang, you shoot. And honestly, if you're going to replace a single laser cannon with a quad laser cannon and then mirror that on the other side of the ship, that's about the limit of the capabilities you should be able to expect, right? I mean, you point the ship in a direction and suddenly you've got 8 laser blasts just flying down range, which is massively overgunned for how small this ship is. But no, we have to make it more complicated. Because yes, each of those quad laser turrets were in fact turrets. And the problem is, the real actual problem is that the operators were buried inside the hull. So the laser cannons, the quad laser turrets, were dangling off the top and bottom of the Millennium Falcon. Fine. That gave them a full 360-degree view and 180-degree range on what they could see and shoot. No big deal, right? Except, since the operator is inside the hull of the ship and only has a concave window to look through, his range of view is really limited. Which means that the operators of those turrets have to rely on, electronic targeting. The cute little 2 grid thingies with the TIE fighter in between them that Han Solo and Chewbacca or Luke Skywalker or whomever used to shoot down whatever ships were chasing them. They used electronic targeting to do that because they certainly couldn't see what they were shooting at because, again, given that they were inside the hull of the ship, not on a dome on the side of the ship, they only had a view range of like 90 degrees all the way around. I mean, they were looking at straight up or straight down with a marginal cone around that, but they were engaging things on a full 360-degree battlefield. Yeah. This is one of those examples of retcons not always working. Like I said, the whole EW has advanced far enough that you can only shoot what you can see makes sense in the Star Wars universe. Until you drop something like the Millennium Falcon into it, where it only targets by electronics. Well, I mean, honestly, it's not that special of a ship. Yes, it's a hero ship, but it is a mass-produced, heavily modified not freighter, which I guess brings us back to that point. You see, in the movies, and basically every other movie, TV show, adaptation, visual presentation of Star Wars, the Millennium Falcon is referred to as a freighter. Han Solo does it, Lando Calrissian does it, everyone does it. It is referred to as a freighter, or a light freighter, or some variation of a freighter. Fine. As previously mentioned, it is a freighter, but we will get to that point. The other point I'm trying to make is that the Haynes manual for the YT-1300 refers to the entire family as a transport. Those are different kinds of vehicles. And that kind of reframing of the situation smells a whole lot like gaslighting or Mandela effect or something along those lines. I don't know. Anyways, I do know that the ship is constantly referred to as a freighter. And out of the blue, now suddenly it's just a transport. Yeah, that noise. Doubly that noise in light of the whole intermodal freight aspect of the YT-1300 class. And that is just the absolute worst retcon of all retcons that ever retconned. I will get to why the YT-1300 is itself, by itself, a horrible freighter. But first I want to talk about its whole, towboat functionality. And I guess before we get there, I should actually talk about the difference between a tugboat and a towboat. Because oddly enough, there are different things. And not in the way you think they are. See, a tugboat, by, again, your horrific Wikipedia system, is defined as a marine vessel that maneuvers other vessels by pushing or pulling them with direct contact or a tow line. In other words, they help big ships tie up against the pier. Or they help pull things out of the way, or they help push things down a river or up a river. And this is where it gets a little weird, because tugs can push barges. This is not outside the definition of a tugboat. After all, it is pushing another vessel by direct contact. A towboat, on the other hand, and it's not really actually on the other hand, is a boat specifically designed for pushing barges or car floats. These are vessels that have flat bows that can push massive numbers of barges upstream, or downstream, in fact. On the Mississippi River in your United States of America province, country, nation, state thing, a towboat on the Mississippi River can have up to 42 barges in its charge, and the entire assembly that the towboat is in charge of could be 200 feet wide and over 1,200 feet long. Generally speaking, tugboats are responsible for 1, 2, maybe 3 barges. Towboats are a whole different animal, and mostly operate as the back end of a propulsion system that moves the rest of the ship forward, whereas tugboats frequently have omnidirectional propulsion that allows them greater maneuverability so as they can park bigger ships and do more complicated things than, say, towboats, which again just push things up and down rivers, basically, or across oceans. Not necessarily across oceans, up and down coasts. I don't think towboats actually go across oceans because that's a whole different animal of nautical nightmares. But still, we're talking about a huge composite ship that is powered by a little tiny thing at the back. That's towboats for you, I guess. And apparently that is the nightmare retcon that I keep referring to, because it turns out that the YT-1300 class, with its happy little mandibles at the front, is a towboat. No, I'm not making this up. I really wish I was. You see, apparently these mandibles are meant to hold a cargo carriage between them, and then this long shaft coming out of the front of the YT-1300, oh my dear was meant to have cargo containers bolted onto its top and bottom, which is supposed to explain the rationalization behind the offset cockpit so that the cockpit would not be behind the cargo containers. Yeah. So you're telling me that this somewhat sizable ship with these janky engines and these centerline mounted turrets and this line of sight forward bolted primary turret that was what it came with initially was meant to pile up these cargo containers on the front of it, top and bottom wise, extending out ahead of it to the point where it would literally obstruct vision and block the cannons. And Corellian Engineering Corporation actually, honest to God, developed a small ship that was supposed to bolt onto that cargo rail that the YT-1300 was holding out in front of it, called the Freight Loading External Rover, that was meant to help with the loading and unloading of the cargo containers itself. So basically you have this little tiny ship at the end of a stalk with all these little cargo pods bolted on the top and bottom of the stalk. And finally at the back you have a Millennium Falcon analog pushing the entire assembly along, going somewhere. Who in the unholy came up with this idea? I mean, there are retcons and then there are disasters like this one. Don't get me wrong, I do love me some intermodal freight, but this is not the way to make it happen. I mean, not only do you never see these cargo containers ever again anywhere else in Star Wars, but you're creating this massive long lever arm that is seriously affecting the maneuvering capabilities of the YT-1300 back at the stern. I mean, yeah, the towboats on the Mississippi aren't exactly the most maneuverable things either, but they don't exactly have a moment arm. They have a moment block. They're pushing something that's 200 feet wide and 1,200 feet long, whereas the intermodal freight mode for the YT class is this long old stalk sticking out there. If you turn too hard, the damn thing's going to snap right off. But that's not even the worst part. We're getting to the worst part. I want you to take a moment and think about every single internal shot of the Millennium Falcon you have ever seen in however many Star Wars movies you have watched. Think about it. Visualize it. Picture it in your head. And with that picture in your head in mind, so to speak, where exactly was the Millennium Falcon's cargo hold? Where? Where was the cargo on the ship? Now, Han Solo mentioned that he had smuggling compartments, we even stuffed people in them. But where was the actual cargo hold? Well, it turns out the Millennium Falcon actually had 3 disjoint cargo holds, according, again, canonically, to the owner's workshop manual from Haynes. That said, they're all functionally useless. First off, if you can somehow believe it, between those 2 mandibles at the stern of that open area is where Han had tucked his concussion missile launchers that he totally should not have had. But the part that you probably can't believe is that the space between those upper and lower concussion missile launchers is supposed to be an airlock. Now, I question whether it's an airlock for, tiny organisms or droids or something along those lines, because ain't no Humie fitting through that door. The funny thing is that while the Millennium Falcon was in the possession of Lando Calrissian, he actually had a YT dart installed between the front mandibles, a small tugboat-style ship that could be used as a tugboat, kind of like the FLER monstrosity, or as an escape pod. And with that system installed, there was an actual, full Humie-sized airlock, about the same size as the port and starboard airlocks, by which you would access the dart. Somehow that got removed by the time Han Solo showed up in episode 4. So I have no idea what's going on. Maybe it's yet another one of the endless nightmarish customizations of the YT-1300. But either way, that is apparently how you access the forward two cargo compartments, one of which is absolutely tiny. And then on the starboard stern section of the ship is the third cargo compartment. And otherwise, these spaces are only accessible by the main circular crew passageway at the core of the ship. So in order to load the cargo compartment on the starboard side, you have to either use the starboard docking ring or the starboard boarding ramp and pull the cargo into the ship near the core, walk around the passageway, and then put the cargo in the cargo compartment. Now, yes, that particular cargo compartment does actually have an elevator of its own, but you're only bringing up, say, one box at a time, given how small the elevator is. In other words, the Millennium Falcon definitely fails the whole unloading and loading as quickly as possible checkmark for being a good freighter. If it were a good freighter, there would be airlocks for each of the cargo holds and you could just dump the cargo out and be on your way. And yes, I can already hear your complaints. The Millennium Falcon is a highly customized YT-1300, not technically one of the YT-1300F models, which were specifically designed for freighting things around. What about those? Yeah, hate to break it to you, but they ain't no better. I mean, okay, in fairness, they do have significantly more cargo holds, and those cargo holds are significantly larger. But they still have the problem of you're either using this forward airlock that no one seems to really understand how it could work or how anything could fit into it, or you're loading things through the port or starboard docking rings or boarding ramps, pulling it to the central ring, and then distributing it to whichever hold it needs to go to. Or, finally, you're using the tiny little elevators to load the cargo from underneath the YT. So, I guess the good news, what little good news there is to be found here, is that there's lots of ways to load cargo onto the YTs. You know, because they're freighters. Except none of the ways are particularly efficient. You're either loading the cargo the slowest possible way imaginable, or you're having to tote it 3 times farther than you ever should have to. And ironically, given the whole intermodal retcon, the cargo you would be loading will have to fit through a normal hatch, like a Hume-sized hatch. You ain't bringing some grand piano onto a YT to freight it anywhere. The elevators aren't big enough, the hatches aren't big enough, and most of the cargo holds aren't even big enough. What exactly is this stupid thing meant to carry? Well, I guess, actually, the personnel transport version of the YT is not unreasonable. It can carry 15 humanoid organisms wherever they're going. But that's still a pretty big ship to only carry 15 humanoid organisms. And the personnel model actually disposes with the boarding ramps, instead converting them into boarding ladders, and then uses the docking ring space for larger escape pods than the standard T-types. Except then you're severely limiting who and what can load onto the passenger-type model. I mean, yeah, they say that if the organisms or droids or whatever can't climb a ladder, they can use the freight elevator at the stern of the ship, but man, that's kind of demeaning to all the huts and all the droids and all the everything else out there that can't climb a ladder. Escape pods are all good and well, but you'd think they'd find somewhere else to put a boarding ramp. And then, ironically, Corellian Engineering Corporation tried to split the difference and produced an FP model that did neither particular job well. Now, what you might be picking up from all these various conversations about all the various models of the YT-1300 class is, yes, it was, in fact, highly customizable. This was one of its selling points for the Corellian Engineering Corporation as a whole. There was everything from a heavily armored courier to just a little backwater planet hopper. And they would cheerfully make whatever you wanted and sell it to you, and then modify it however way you wanted it. Now, of course, this causes an absolute nightmare for maintenance because when a YT-1300 shows up in your shop, you have no idea what you're looking at from the outside. Although, there were options for such things as, cockpit placement. And some of the options actually make sense. Unlike, for example, the Millennium Falcon's configuration. Although, I suppose, in light of the intermodal cargo retcon, the cockpit could possibly make sense because now the mandibles will be holding on to cargo pods as opposed to the cockpit itself. If you put the cockpit at the center, you can't do the whole intermodal thing. Likewise, if you offset the cockpit, that at least allows you to see forward while the cargo pods are stacked above and below the rail that they're attached to that your mandible is holding on to. Fine. It's still a stupid retcon, and offset cockpits for you organics are also relatively stupid. Your species has actually experimented with offset cockpits for aircraft and spacecraft-ish things over the years. For example, the Blohm & Voss BV-141 was an experimental asymmetrical observation aircraft for the Nazis. It didn't go anywhere. Likewise, the White Knight II aircraft, meant to carry the Spaceship II extraterrestrial vehicle, has an offset cockpit simply by dint of being a carrier for a smaller aircraft, and that's the way they decided to design it. But that whole system really isn't going anywhere either. Either way, the reality is that cockpits are centerline on your aircraft for a whole pile of reasons. Admittedly, some of the important ones like, say, drag and weight distribution are somewhat immaterial in the Star Wars universe, but still, for the pilots, conceptualizing an aircraft that is symmetrical around you is so much easier than one that is radically asymmetrical. If nothing else, when you plan on rolling the spacecraft, rotating it about the axis that goes through its bow and stern, is it going to rotate around the center of mass, the center of gravity? Where the cockpit is, somewhere in between? How do you know? Is there a switch that allows you to control where it rotates when you throw that joystick over? Does the maneuver vary by model type? Is it something that Corellian Engineering Corporation can customize you? Why am I asking so many questions about something that should be so simple? The cockpit should be at the center. This is basically the same problem that the B-Wing has with its massively offset cockpit, except it was specifically designed to exploit that, with the entire ship rotating around the cockpit while the cockpit remains, relatively speaking, level. On the other hand, the Millennium Falcon's cockpit is still locked into the rest of the ship and will do crazy maneuvers with the rest of the ship. And speaking of, since you put the cockpit out on a moment arm, if you do roll the ship and it does roll about the center of mass of the ship, congratulations, you're attempting to throw the entire cockpit crew against the outboard bulkhead. Yes, I know the Millennium Falcon has inertial dampeners and all the rest of that nonsense, but why make them work if they don't have to? And that's even without talking about how sticking the cockpit on the side is just begging for it to be shot off. At least if you put it centerline, it's at least protected by somewhat more of the ship's mass. Now, yes, in fairness, a centerline cockpit is an option, and a heavily armored to the point of absurdity and no windows cockpit is also an option if you have to go really, really bad places, but most of the YTs have the cockpit on either the port or starboard side for whatever reason. And speaking of asymmetry, you know the dish on the Millennium Falcon? The dish that started out as being a flush mount with Lando Calrissian and then turned into a big old, standard style radio radar dish with Han Solo, and then that got snapped off, and then, Lando had a rectangular dish after that? I guess Han did too, but it was while Lando was flying it. Yeah. That is apparently the sensor rectenna for the YT-1300 class ship. Yeah, that's the sensor array. It's mounted on top of the ship. You almost never see it rotate. Do I really need to explain how this is a problem? And then Han Solo, in his infinite stupidity, went and added a jamming module to the rectenna itself. Now, jammers are useful, don't get me wrong, but mounting the jammer in the same equipment as your sensor suite is going to, and actually did, cause a whole ton of problems. You're starting to understand why Princess Leia was so shocked he came in that thing, right? Alright, fine. I probably used up enough time bitching at you about how the YT-1300 is a horrible freighter. Hopefully I've hit all the points I was thinking about talking about, and if not, I guess I'll just circle back and revisit it again in the future. However, as a counterpoint, you might be wondering if there is a freighter in the Star Wars universe that meets with my approval. Yes, there is. Ironically, it was phased out in favor of the YT-1300. Hell, it was even made by the Corellian Engineering Corporation as well. It doesn't have a cool name like YT-1300 or anything like that. In fact, it was called the Barlaws class medium freighter. It was just marginally bigger than the YT series, could carry more cargo, and just look at the beauty of that thing. It has massive loading ramps. It has a massive, uniform, coherent, connected cargo bay. It has a cargo elevator that might actually be able to carry something. It has all kinds of stuff. It could actually carry passengers in addition to a significant chunk of cargo as opposed to the either or the horrible compromise of the YTs. And for whatever reason, Corellian Engineering Corporation decided that this was not good enough and went with the YT-1300 class instead. I suppose what it comes down to in the end is nothing more than a matter of style. The Barlaws looks like exactly what it is, a freighter, whereas the YT-1300, courtesy especially of all the customizations available to it, can look like whatever you want it to look like. And whatever it ends up looking like, it will be distinctive, simply because it is kind of a flying saucer, it has the mandibles, it has all that stuff going on. But you have to ask yourself, if the YT-1300 ship were just a background ship in the Star Wars universe and Han Solo flew something else, would you be nearly as upset with me about pointing out its various and sundry failings, of which there are many, as you are now? Or is it only because she is a hero ship, and thereby she is one of the things we slaughter here at Sacred Cow Shipyards? After all, given the date on your planet, I just had to drop a nuke of my own. And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the docks for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.